Mike Brown, the former FEMA director.
Joining us here is the former FEMA director.
History, I think, was very unkind to you, my friend. Very unkind.
Mr. Brown, thanks for being with us.
This is Michael Brown Unplugged.
Happy Monday, everybody, and welcome to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. I thought we would start the week out with some really good, positive news. You know, like what's going on in Los Angeles. The great Dr. Drew Pinsky said this in a recent interview.
We have not seen condition for humans like this since medieval times, period, and that's a fact. But if you get them
Dr. Drew Pinsky is scared and outraged, and on his radio show in L.A., he no longer holds back.
Tuberculosis is exploding, non-tuberculous acid-fast bacilli exploding, and then the rat-borne illnesses, plague and typhus. And then we had typhoid fever last week. I didn't think that, I missed that. I mean, so typhoid fever means, now we have oral fecal contamination, so that's going to mean parasites and cholera. Here we go, everybody. Just everything you found in your history books, we got it. It's coming.
He says that bubonic plague, Black Death as it was known, which killed 25 million people over a 5-year period in the Middle Ages, is likely already present in L.A. It is caused by fleas biting rats and spreading it to humans, and an army of rats, millions strong, has overthrown Los Angeles. They have infested City Hall. The LAPD station in downtown L.A. was fined by the state for rodent infestation. 2 employees have been infected by typhus. Cops have been diagnosed with typhoid fever, hepatitis A, and staff. Look at this. Under this overpass on the 405, on one side there is nothing. On the other side, a line of tents and garbage. That's because one side is in Culver City. Culver City doesn't allow them. The other side is in Los Angeles. Los Angeles does.
Do you feel like you're shouting into the wind? I am screaming into the wind. And I feel like, and I feel this way every day, like I'm standing on a railroad track and the train is coming and I know the bridge is out. And I'm like, hey, stop, stop, stop. And the engineers are looking at me and give me the finger. We are on the eve of really serious trouble.
Now, I thought the fact that Dr. Pinsky said that there were rats in City Hall, I thought he meant the rats in City Hall. So while we have Los Angeles going through this period of, diseases that we haven't seen since medieval times, bubonic plague, typhus, all of these things going on, all caused by the kind of Marxist policies that say everything goes, there are no guardrails, and we're going to just let Los Angeles turn into a third world city inside the world's most powerful place on earth, the United States of America. And while that's going on, it is, I was going to say it's kind of funny, but I actually find it kind of disgusting that at the same time this is going on, it seems to me that sometimes we might have our priorities just a little bit screwed up. Because if you get on the 405, if you get on US 1 and you just go north to San Francisco is tackling the serious problems.
San Francisco is set to become the first U.S. city to ban the sale of e-cigarettes. City officials unanimously voted in favor of the ban Tuesday, and Mayor London Breed has indicated she'll sign off on it. The ban also applies to flavored tobacco products. Proponents of the bill say e-cigarettes have not been properly assessed by the Food and Drug Administration for safety. The spread of vaping among young people in recent years has raised concerns about the long-term health effects of the products. Opponents of the bill say the ban could cause people to turn back to conventional cigarettes. Juul, the most popular producer of e-cigarettes, is headquartered in San Francisco.
I like the fact that the unintended consequences of banning e-cigarettes is that people may go back to regular tobacco. Think about how stupid this is. What is it, what is it about people that get elected to elective office? I don't care whether it's as U.S. congressman or it's as dog catcher. Well, pretty much one and the same, right? But what fascinates me is this idea that government or that individuals that comprise the government knows what's better for you than you do. What is it about taking away people's choices? What is it about the fact that liberals that ostensibly are all for choice, Why, we want everybody to make their own decisions. Why, if you want to be able to throw milkshakes on somebody at an Antifa protest in Portland, Oregon, then you ought to be able to throw milkshakes on people mixed in with cement or cement, whichever you use. You ought to be able to do that. But by damned, if you're going to smoke an e-cigarette, you're not going to be able to do that in San Francisco. Meanwhile, while you're trying to get rid of your e-cigarette because that's been banned, so now you're trying to find a convenience store so you can buy a regular cigarette, because let's face it, nicotine is an addictive substance, and whether you're consuming nicotine through an e-cigarette or you're consuming it through a conventional cigarette, what difference does it make, to quote a famous former Secretary of State and presidential candidate? What difference does it make? But there is just something strange, very strange, about the idea that you get elected and suddenly you start taking away people's choices. Now, I have a confession. I have a personality trait. I started to say a personality disorder, but I'm not actually convinced that it's a personality disorder. I just think it's a trait. And I think it stems from the fact that women, for those of you women that are listening, you know that men never grow up. And so the minute you tell, for example, if you've got a young male rugrat at home, which begs the question, how do you know if it's a male or not? I mean, come on. It may or may not be a male, depending on how that particular individual decides to identify. But let's just make a big-ass presumption here for a moment that you have a male rugrat at home. Here's what I think the personality disorder or the personality trait is. You tell most boys that you shouldn't do something because it's dangerous or because it could be harmful to you. That's like telling them there's no speed limit. Holy crap. Then, so I can't have an e-cig? Then I'm going to get an e-cig. This is the absolute craziness that I simply do not understand. Oh, I get it. I get it that it's all about control, power. It's all about somebody exercising their belief that whatever they think is right and that what everybody else thinks is wrong, or that they somehow know better than you what's best for you. But shouldn't we, instead of constantly trying to find things that we want to somehow ban, that we want to take people's choices away? So at the time that you're walking around San Francisco and you realize that you can't smoke an e-cigarette, so instead you're trying to find a regular cigarette. So you're trying to find a grocery store, a convenience store, someplace where you can go in and actually buy, I don't know, a pack of Marlboros. You're too busy trying to skirt around the homeless people. You're too busy trying to skirt around the drug abusers and the drug users. And while you're doing all of that, you're trying to make certain that you don't step into a pile of human feces. But oh, by golly, San Francisco is going to make sure that you can't smoke an e-cigarette, even though they readily admit that the unintended consequence might be that you actually increase cigarette consumption. But as long as we can exercise power and control over somebody else, that's what we're going to do. Drives me nuts. So as long as we're talking about, adolescent males, maybe it was because, and I freely admit, as I told you last week, I did not watch either one of the Democrat presidential debates. I just could not muster up the kind of gut-wrenching, soul-searching, intestinal fortitude that it would take to watch a bunch of dumbasses. And by the way, why do we call them debates? Why do we call this glorified press conference? Because let me ask you this question. What do you think was more important in the Democrat presidential debates last week? Do you think it was the 20 people that took turns standing in front of the cameras? Or do you think it was the 5 yahoos that were asking the questions? Because all honesty, I think, and here's why I think this. I saw somewhere, the proverbial somewhere, like someone, well, people tell us this. I saw a photograph of a street corner in Washington, D.C., and it was advertising NBC and MSNBC's coverage of the presidential debates. Now, if you think that the most important people in that television studio were the 20 candidates. Oh, you would be so wrong. Because the photograph I saw at the bus stop, you know how you have the bus stops, those little enclosures where the homeless hang out at night or during the day. If it gets really rainy and nasty, people kind of crowd into them to get out of the rain. Well, I saw one of those bus stops, and on the side, I don't even remember what the picture was about, but I could just tell on the side that there was a big kind of poster about NBC and MSNBC hosting the Democrat presidential debate. And if you thought that the most important people at those debates were the candidates, that advertisement, or advertisement, as some people say, that advertisement would tell you otherwise. Because instead of having, I don't know, a montage of some sort of a kaleidoscope of the 20 numbnuts running on the presidential, on the Democratic candidate slate, instead it had the 5 moderators. Yes, because those were the most important people. But here's what I did not know about the debates. And I'd be curious if you knew this or not, because my guess is most of you didn't know it either. And that was, you know how these networks, cable channels, always have the focus groups? Like Fox News always has Frank Luntz, and Frank Luntz has a focus group. And, you know, and they have the little meter, so they turn the dial, you know, when something really, you know, resonates with them or something really irritates with them, they turn the dial clockwise or counterclockwise, and then Frank Luntz asks questions about that, and people raise their hands, well, you know, how many agree, how many disagree? Well, guess what NBC and MSNBC did? They had teenagers. And I guess the reason they had teenagers is because if you're trying to decide whether to vote for, you know, Howdy Doody John Hickenlooper, former governor of Colorado, or the accidental senator Michael Bennet, the senior senator from the state of Colorado, or Tulsi Gabbard or whatever her name is, or Pocahontas or Elizabeth Warren, or I don't know, Bernie Sanders or anybody, who would you want to turn to? You want to turn to teenagers, right? They had a debate teen panel discussion about what teenagers thought. And don't get me wrong, I'm all for teaching civics. And if they want to have a panel or they want to invite teenagers to attend the debate, I'm all for that. But guess who could not care less about what teenagers thought about what was said on that panel? That's right, moi. I don't care. But here's why you should. Yes, yeah, I don't care, but you should. Listen to this.
Did you get the specifics on the economic issues that we talked about in our before the debate that you were hoping for? I mean, Mayor de Blasio specifically kept talking about how he wants to shift the Democratic Party back to being the party of the working class, but never really gave me any, specific policy solutions for it. And the fact of the matter is that Blue Collar America is happening in Pennsylvania, Ohio, Wisconsin, Michigan, those key states that the president won in 2016 because this message resonated with those kinds of voters. Blue Collar America isn't happening as much in New York City as it is in places like that, in places, like me at home in West Virginia. So I felt like that, a lot of the candidates sort of talked about, Elizabeth Warren talked about the poor people, but I felt like it was more about, helping them as poor people and not getting them back on their feet, finding jobs for them and putting them into careers where they can support their families again.
I've always had a trouble with the idea that it is the government's responsibility to find somebody a job, or that it's responsibility of the government to help a family feed somebody else, because that's inefficient and ineffective. It's a poor use of tax dollars, and there's a much more efficient, compassionate way to do that, and that's through private charitable organizations. But I'm just a radical about that. I do believe, don't get me wrong, I do believe that there ought to be some sort of social safety net for those who are truly incapable, not unable, incapable of helping themselves. I'm okay with having a safety net that is limited in scope and very narrowly defined as to whom would qualify for that social safety net. But these teenagers are all concerned because, and I guess they don't understand that Bill de Blasio is a communist, but they're all concerned about, but they were talking about poor people. And here in West Virginia, or wherever the hell they were, in West Virginia, you know, we have poor people and we've got blue-collar workers, and some of them are having a hard time finding a job. And Mayor de Blasio talked on and on and on about how he cares about those people, but he never told us how he was going to help them find a job or help them put food on their plate. If you don't think that there is not indoctrination going on inside public education, you're not paying attention. But then the teen panels address probably the most pertinent issue in last week's debate, the speaking of Spanish.
What were some eye roll moments? Because I definitely saw some from you guys. Ariane, I saw a lot from you when Cory Booker was talking. I saw a couple, like, oh, God, from you guys. So what were some of those things that you weren't so thrilled about?
When Beto spoke Spanish.
You didn't like it?
Initially, I don't want to say I didn't like it, but I think it caught some people off guard, and you could see even some of the other candidates were a little shaken up by that, so I thought that was
Booker's expression is trending all over Twitter.
I think just as the Spanish speaking went on, I thought that it was great when Beto did it the first time, but then as it continued on with the multiple candidates, I felt like, especially with Booker, it kind of felt like pandering. For some reason, it just didn't feel as genuine coming from him. And I just feel like any moments that didn't feel as genuine coming from the candidates, when we talked about, like, identity politics, when Booker kept talking about his neighborhood repeatedly in kind of the same fashion, I felt like that was an eye roll moment for me.
An eye roll. Good for her. And the use of the term pandering. Pandering warms the cockles of my heart to think that teenagers watching the debates thought that the speaking of Spanish and talking about their neighborhoods were eye-rolling moments that really amounted to not much more than just simple pandering. So while I may tell you I don't care, and I really don't care about what teenagers think, the fact that these particular teenagers, well, I was going to say that they actually had some good things to say, but then there's this soundbite too.
I'm also very interested in the preventative care model that a lot of the Democratic candidates have seemed to suggest tonight, where we look at the root causes of the issue, whether that is gun control or immigration or health care. And we notice that there's a lack of economic opportunity, and there's also a lack of care services that are implemented throughout one's lifetime that might result in these really terrible social issues.
I don't know. I have no idea what that means. I have no idea what it means, and nor do I care. But if I'm going to make fun of teenagers and some of the inane comments that they make about these 20 candidates running on the Democrat ticket, then I feel, in order to comply with the fairness doctrine, which does not apply to this podcast, that in order to be fair and balanced, what other cliches can I borrow? Then if I'm going to make fun of teenagers, then I think I'm required to make fun of 94-year-old former presidents whose last name is Carter and first name is Jimmy. Jimmy Carter said what bless his heart, truly bless his heart. There reaches a point where, you know what? I know you're a former president. You've probably done a lot of nice things with Habitat for Humanity, but I think you're wrong on Middle East policy. I think you were wrong on most of your policies. But when you say this,
Russia has been proven by our intelligence community to have interfered with one of our human rights, which is the right of free and fair elections. What's your reaction?
I got to pause for just a moment. This was some forum, because I saw, all I could see when I watched the YouTube video was the moderator whom I did not recognize, Jimmy Carter, and then next to Jimmy Carter was Walter Mondale. So maybe these are like failed, Democrat candidates, Democrat presidents convention or something. I don't know. But I want to back this up for a second, because it is clear, and in fact, It was Rod Rosenstein. I couldn't think of his name. It was former Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein who came out during that press conference and very specifically said, yes, there were attempts by the Ruskies to somehow influence not only the 2016 but the 2018 elections, but there was zero. Z-E-R-O. There was zero evidence that the Russians were successful in changing any vote tabulations whatsoever. So as much as the Russians may want to pat themselves on the back that they were accused of, or that somehow they may have slightly influenced, I don't know, a couple of voters here or there to change their mind or whatever, no actual votes were changed. In other words, there were no printed ballots, electronic ballots, mail-in ballots, ballots on a piece of bark, no matter what. There were no ballots that were changed by the Russians.
Russia has been proven by our intelligence community to have interfered with one of our human rights.
No, not interfered. The Russians were found guilty of trying to interfere, of trying to influence. But there is no evidence that there was any collusion or that their attempt at buying, I don't know, what was it, $80,000 worth of Facebook ads, that there was any ability or any success by the Russians of actually changing any votes. So the premise of the question to begin with is wrong. But that's not going to stop Jimmy Carter.
The right of free and fair elections. What's your reaction? How should we deal with Russia?
Well, the president himself should condemn it, admit that it happened, which I think 16 of the intelligence agencies have already agreed to say. And there's no doubt that the Russians did interfere in the election. And I think the interference, although not yet quantified, if fully investigated, would show that Trump didn't actually win.
Whoa. Wait a minute. So it hasn't been quantified yet, but if we could just have some sort of investigation. Jimmy Carter is suggesting that if we could just have some sort of investigation, we might be able to prove that the Russians did something. So here's what I would propose. Don't tell Jimmy otherwise, but somebody get to Jimmy Carter, maybe go through Rosalind, I don't know, go through Amy, and say, hey, Mr. President, guess what? They heard you on the Michael Brown Unplugged podcast, and Michael Brown agrees with you. And so Michael Brown has proposed that the federal government spend 2.5 years and $25 million to investigate whether or not there was Russian interference, whether or not there was Russian influence on the elections. Think that'd make Jimmy happy? Oh, we did that? Oh, well, then never mind.
Election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put into office because the Russians interfered.
Oh, Trump was put in office because the Russians interfered. Look, no, I'm not going to say it. That's too cruel. But at some point, just shut up.
On his behalf.
So do you believe President Trump is an illegitimate president?
Based on what I just said, which I can't retract.
Oh, Jimmy. And in a rare moment of quasi-journalism integrity, PBS's NewsHour actually reported objectively on what Jimmy Carter said.
In a related development, former President Jimmy Carter said he believes President Trump actually lost the 2016 election, but Russian interference won him the White House anyway. Mr. Carter spoke in Virginia at a discussion on human rights. Historian John Meacham asked if that means he thinks the Trump presidency is, quote, illegitimate.
There's no doubt that the Russians did interfere in the election, and I think the interference, although not yet quantified, if fully investigated, would show that Trump didn't actually win the election in 2016. He lost the election, and he was put into office because the Russians interfered.
In a 2017 report, U.S. intelligence agencies concluded that Russia did interfere in the 2016 election to help Mr. Trump. They did not assess whether those actions affected the outcome.
I might have worded it slightly different. But nonetheless, I think for PBS, it's at least a quasi-objective report on what Jimmy Carter said versus the reality of what really took place. On a, I was going to say on a more serious note, but I guess 94-year-old ex-presidents not knowing what's going on around them is a fairly serious note. But in a serious note of concern that I have about what's happening in this country, I want to go to Portland, Oregon for a while. CNN has been claiming that President Trump has made the United States a dangerous place for journalists. And, of course, you know, that's the narrative of Jim Acosta, the CNN reporter, that he makes himself the story as opposed to just covering the news. There is this idea that somehow, and we also have, of course, the president leaning over to Vladimir Putin at the G20 summit and saying, yeah, we got you don't have this problem. We got a problem with fake news and stuff. And Putin kind of laughed about it. And he was asked to tell Putin, or if he would tell Putin not to meddle in the election. And of course, by now, all of you have seen the soundbite. I'm not going to play it for you, where he leans over to Putin and says, "Hey, don't meddle in our elections." And Putin kind of laughs and says something to the effect like, "Yeah, we don't," or whatever. But the point I want to make is that CNN, for years now, has been touting how the president is a danger to civil liberties in this country because he calls, in particular, CNN fake news. Well, here's some really fake news from CNN. On Saturday, there was an Antifa protest in downtown Portland, Oregon. I can't even imagine how utterly chaotic downtown Portland must have been over the weekend. Antifa, of course, they're a bunch of wusses, a bunch of cowards that are wearing masks hiding. They're also wearing gloves that have brass knuckles on them and other items. They're embedded with all sorts of sharp objects. There were people that in a circus atmosphere were giving away milkshakes so that you could, first of all, they start throwing milkshakes at Nigel Farage in the United Kingdom, and that rapidly crosses the Atlantic, like the bubonic plague or typhus or something, crosses the Atlantic and infects Portland, Oregon, to the point that the Antifa groups actually had little booths set up where you could go get giant Slurpee milkshakes and throw those milkshakes on people just walking down the street. Now, Antifa, whom I believe are truly Marxist, communist, anarchist terrorists, they're just itching for a fight. They want a civil war. And I would say this to Antifa: be careful what you wish for, because just if, conservatives and libertarians and other freedom-loving people finally get enough of you and turn on you, which I hope they don't, but if they do, you will lose big time. You'll be able to claim for a little while, and of course the liberals in the media will come to your aid and help you all they can, just like I'm about to tell you about CNN. But over the long run, you will lose that battle, and you will lose that war. So be careful what it is that you ask for. Anyway, back on Saturday, it was allegedly right-wing journalist Andy Ngo. Now, if you don't know Andy Ngo, you should follow him on Twitter at Andy, and his last name is spelled NGO, just like non-government organization. NGO, Andy Ngo. And Andy's been covering all of this leftist, anarchist, Marxist protests around the country. Some claim that he's not a journalist, but I would actually say he's doing a hell of a lot more journalism than CNN does. Anyway, he was viciously assaulted by left-wing Antifa terrorists to the point that he was hospitalized with, last I checked, Mayor, I don't know what the latest diagnosis is, but he was having a brain hemorrhage. Serious attack. The other thing that bugs me about this story is this. There were stories that the milkshakes that Antifa was using to throw at people as they just went about their business in downtown Portland contained concrete cement mix, some sort of hardening substance that as the milkshake was thrown onto the clothing or the face or skin or whatever else of somebody walking around, it would start to harden and, of course, cause damage. And if you don't think that that's assault and battery, then you don't understand what assault and battery is. Because in my opinion, that is nothing that is nothing less than an assault and battery. But the Portland police did nothing to stop it. The Portland police actually had the hashtag dumbassery or the unmitigated gall or the stupidity or the lack of self-awareness to tweet out on Saturday and Sunday that if you happen to get splashed or hit by one of these milkshakes that has the hardening substance in it, please report that to the police. Now, what can you infer from that? What you can infer from that is the Portland Police Department stood down. The Portland Police Department did nothing. Back to CNN. So here you have riots in Portland, and you have the Portland Police Department, at the request of the city council, the mayor and the city council, standing back while violence is perpetrated upon its citizens in its downtown area. I don't know why anybody would go to Portland. So CNN media reporter Brian Stetler took 47 seconds out of his hour-long Sunday program yesterday, it's called Reliable Sources, to condemn the attack. 47 seconds. Now, to his credit, the sentiment that he expressed was correct. But the time allocated to the topic was pathetic, especially considering that he allowed almost 4 minutes and, well, it was 3 minutes and 57 seconds to be exact. He allowed almost 4 minutes to the shutting down of a small Ohio newspaper. Well, isn't that like a dog bites man story? Newspaper shutting down? Hardly news. But even worse than that was Brian Stetler on CNN's inability, unwillingness, or just utter failure to call out or condemn his colleagues like Chris Cuomo, Don Lemon, and Camille Ball, who have used their program to actually preach on behalf of Portland. Brian Stetler said this.
Story that you need to know about before we take a break. This is a protest that turned violent against a member of the media in Portland, Oregon this weekend. Conservative journalist Andy Ngo was out there covering rival protests on Saturday. Antifa on one side, right-wing figures on the other side. But as the demonstrations clashed, protesters, it appears to be Antifa protesters, then attacked Ngo. He's been out there in the past. He's been covering protests in Portland for quite some time. His critics say he's there to cause trouble. But that's unacceptable. The idea that he would be attacked, that he would be bloodied in that way, unacceptable, period. And it's important that everyone make that clear, even left-wing critics who don't like him and things like that. There's much still to be, much more we don't know yet about all the circumstances, but disturbing to see that in Portland.
Now, why do I point out how hypocritical it is of Brian Stetler to take 47 seconds of this? So last year, Chris Cuomo argued that Antifa had, are you ready for this? That they had morality on their side. Here's Cuomo, quote, "But I argue to you tonight, all punches are not equal morally, but fighting hate is right. And in a clash between hate and those who oppose it are on the side of right." I'm not even going to try to argue the logic of that. I mean, it is so illogical. And then this year, that same Chris Cuomo, whose brother Andrew is the governor of New York, suggested that Antifa fought for a, quote, good cause. Now, you explain to me, what good cause is it that you brutalize a journalist who is simply trying to cover the actual violent acts of a left-wing Marxist organization? Over on CNN, a program called United Shades of America, this woman that hosts that program normalized Antifa violence, when she found humor in one member who carries around a large pocket knife and pink brass knuckles. And then, of course, there's Don Lemon, who told Cuomo that, quote, sometimes you can fight by praising them or being nice to them, but you got to fight fire with fire.
Not equal morally. In the eyes of the law, yes. But in the eyes of good and evil, here's the argument.
They are strictly principled anti-fascists. And what they see in the Trump administration and what they see happening in this country, they see the neo-fascism that we see. And they've taken a principled stand to stand against white supremacists and white nationalists wherever they may show up.
It says it right in the name, Antifa, anti-fascism, which is what they were there fighting. Listen, there's no organization is perfect. There was some violence.
I think that a lot of people recognize that when pushed, self-defense is a legitimate response to white supremacist and neo-Nazi violence.
The problem is to equate the violence in reaction against bigotry with the bigotry itself is to misunderstand the fact that when you go to cancer treatment, the radiation is tough treatment, but it is meant to remove the cancer.
They wouldn't have been anywhere near there had it not been for the fact that white supremacists, neo-Nazis were out scaring the living daylights out of most of the people in that town.
Thuggishness is thuggishness wherever it comes from politically, and we should be the first to call it out.
I disagree.
CNN actually out there justifying the violence against journalists. And forget Andy Ngo for a minute. How about just the citizens of Portland? Or how about the anarchy that is taking hold of the streets of Portland because the police department, even though they're in full riot gear, stands back, stands aside? That's the breakdown of society. That's exactly what Antifa wants. But you know what? And I say this very carefully, and I say it fully understanding the ramifications of what I'm about to say. When the cops stand down, and when the cops refuse to enforce the law, and ordinary private citizens are harmed by the Antifa's tactics and their violence, they're going to push law-abiding citizens to the edge. And at some point, law-abiding citizens will begin to defend themselves. Now, I know that that is exactly what Antifa wants. They want, because they know that they can hide behind the skirts of the journalists who will give them cover. But at some point, you have to defend yourself. You have to take back the streets. And if the cops and law enforcement will not do that, I'm not for vigilantism. I'm not for the law of the wild, wild west. But at some point, you have to defend yourself. And so somebody will. And that will cause a battle, if not a war. But I just want Antifa to know this. If you get what you want, which is a civil war between those who believe in the rule of law, who believe in the Constitution, who believe in the values that this country stands for, versus the Marxism and the communism and the anarchy that you stand for, we will win and you will lose. Mark my words. Okay, kids, let's do a con law class. I want to go back to June 28, 2012. And I know for many of you that is ancient history. And if I ask you what you were doing on the morning of June 28, 2012, like most of us, we wouldn't have a clue. But I bet you remember this. Because on that morning, both CNN and Fox News initially told all of their viewers that the United States Supreme Court had struck down Obamacare, had struck down the individual mandate, because they hadn't finished reading the entire opinion, and they didn't realize that Justice Roberts had saved Obamacare by classifying it as a tax. Fox's Shannon Bream declared that the mandate was gone, and for 6 whole minutes, a CNN chyron blared, individual mandate struck down. Well, the Supreme Court's decision last week, in a case called Department of Commerce versus New York, that's the census question case, was similarly easy to misread at first glance. Now, it does keep the citizenship question off the census, at least for now, because the majority opinion by Chief Justice Roberts actually hands the government a clean win on all of the substantive issues. Let me explain. First, the court held that a citizenship question is constitutional, despite being unnecessary to the word enumeration. The Constitution just requires that, every 10 years that the government conduct an enumeration of people in the country. But then the court said that Wilbur Ross, who's the Commerce Secretary, had actually complied with the federal law governing the administration of the census. And then the court upheld, that the Secretary of Commerce was allowed to overrule career scientists who advised him to gather citizenship data from administrative records instead of from the census. Now, why is that? Because the scientists actually feared that asking the question would cause some immigrants to avoid responding to the census. No proof of that, just an assertion. So then why did the government lose? Well, the answer is really simple. It's because the court found that Secretary Ross had lied, or in the court's more gently worded language, had dissembled. The court said that Secretary Ross had claimed that the Justice Department had told him that improved citizenship data would help the agency enforce the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Now, it was because of that Department of Justice request, and only because of that request, that the question was added, according to the Secretary of Commerce, Wilbur Ross. But the Chief Justice, together with the 4-justice liberal bloc, determined that this rationale was a pretext concocted after Ross had already made up his mind. According to the Chief Justice, the record in front of the court showed that the Voting Rights Act of 1965, that rationale was somehow, and I'm using air quotes, contrived. Here's what Justice Roberts wrote. The record shows that the Secretary began taking steps to reinstate a citizenship question about a week into his tenure, but it contains no hint that he was considering the Voting Rights Act enforcement in connection with that project. The director of the census initially attempted to elicit requests for citizenship data from the Department of Homeland Security and the Department of Justice's Executive Office for Immigration Review, neither of which is that's my emphasis, neither of which is responsible for enforcing the Voting Rights Act. It was not, the Justice wrote, the Chief Justice, it was not until the Secretary contacted the Attorney General directly that the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division expressed interest in acquiring census-based citizenship data to better enforce the Voting Rights Act. So, because the Secretary of Commerce, failed to, quote, offer genuine justifications for an important decision, the majority affirmed the lower court's judgment and remanded the matter back to the Commerce Department. In other words, the court just said, because we don't believe the sincerity of what you claim you did, we're sending this back to the Department of Commerce to review. So this stupid question of sincerity was what divided the chief and the other conservatives. Because my favorite judge, Justice Thomas, he agreed that Secretary Wilbur Ross needed to offer a rational explanation for adding the question. But once satisfied that Ross had done so, Justice Thomas said he would have declined to evaluate whether that explanation was sincere. Here's what Justice Thomas wrote. Our only role in this case is to decide whether the Secretary complied with the law and gave a reasoned explanation for his decision. The court correctly answers these questions in the affirmative. That ought to end our inquiry. Can we get a golf clap for Justice Thomas? Because he's exactly right. But here's where the court went off the rails, in my opinion. Chief Justice Roberts said that a deeper inquiry was needed because accepting contrived reasons would defeat the purpose of judicial review. He wrote, "Unlike a typical case in which an agency may have both stated and unstated reasons for a decision, here the Voting Rights Act enforcement rationale, the sole stated reason, seems to have been contrived." So then the Chief Justice tried to figure out a balance between the court's need for honesty and the executive branch's authority to act politically, and they arrived at a compromise. An agency decision may be influenced by political considerations or prompted by administration's priorities, but it must also explain itself in a way that is consistent with what the record reveals about the agency's priorities and its decision-making process. So there's this University of Chicago law professor, Jennifer Now. She puts it this way: you have to tell us the truth, but you don't have to tell us the whole truth. Now, Justice Alito said he feared that the majority standard would invite trial judges to look for pretexts in other cases. Justice Alito wrote, if this case is taken as a model, then any one of the approximately 1,000 district court judges in this country, upon receiving information that a controversial agency decision might have been motivated by some unstated consideration, may order the questioning of cabinet officers and other high-ranking executive branch officials, and the judge may then pass judgment on whether the decision was pretextual. It's a pretty good warning, in my opinion. Now, an election law professor at the University of California, Irvine, Rick Hasen, says that he doesn't think the government's going to back down. He says that whatever the reason, the agency will likely act to quickly rehabilitate its pretextual ruling. He says the agency had said that printing had to begin in July, which is today, but plaintiffs challenging inclusion of the question have long claimed the real deadline is October. So the government's going to have to concede now that October is doable. So the agency, the Commerce Department and the Census Bureau, could come back with new reasons. They could come back with new reasons and start trying to figuring out a way to actually put in their decision, here's what we really did. Bottom line is this: it's not done. If the Commerce Department would just come clean about all of this, minus the part about helping Republicans, one would expect answering a state's request for improved demographic information to pass the majority of the court's test, even if unstated partisan motivations are underneath that decision. But on the other hand, the government needs a rationale that not only is real, but is also consistent with applicable law, which obviously doesn't contemplate modifying the census for partisan gain. So I think what's going to happen, in the end, if the administration really wants this question on the census, it's going to have to go back to the Supreme Court. Now, I think there is zero chance that the government will win all of the lower court case fights. And when and if it does return to the U.S. Supreme Court, the fate of the citizenship question will again be up to the court's Chief Justice and now the court's kingmaker. So it's not over with. Despite everything you hear in the news media that this decision is now settled, it's not. It's been remanded back to the agency for clarification. Tell us the real reason why you want to do it. They can just make up any reason about here's the real reason we want to do it. Put it on the record. Put the census question back on, the citizenship question back on the census. Somebody's going to take it back up to the Supreme Court. And at that point, what's Justice Roberts going to do? What is Justice Roberts going to do at that point? I think you're lying, Wilbur Ross. I think you're lying. Well, that is not the role of the Supreme Court. I bet the citizenship question gets back on the census. It was back in the 1950s. Why, if it was constitutional then, why is it not constitutional now? Regardless of whatever the reason is that you want to put it back on there. It's a legitimate question. I talked earlier about these teenagers at the presidential debate, and I kind of made fun of them. And now I'm going to do it again, except it's a different group. let's pretend it's way off in the future, say 2020, and a group of really cool teenagers are vaping bleach so they can get high as they sit around in their suburban backyard. They're doing everything they can to prove that they didn't deserve to be born into the lives they were given. They debate whether or not they should start a finger train later, or maybe watch a bunch of videos of murder scenes and maybe watch body cam footage from, lethal police shootings to give themselves some really serious nightmares. Or a strapping young lad named Braden interrupts the discussion by standing up and pulling off his shirt. F, he says, I forgot to show you guys my sick new nip tumors. And there, just as Braden described, were 2 fat lumps on his chest, one under each nipple. Several of the girls in the group swoon at the sight. Another boy, jealous of the attention that Braden is getting, yeah, bitch, check out this feces. His name is Chase. Now you're thinking Chase, C-H-A-S-E, because Chase has yuppie parents. His name is spelled C-H-A-Y-S-E, Chase. On Chase's chest is a full outline of the infinity gauntlet in small tumors, with 6 larger tumors representing each of the 6 infinity stones. Now, the group of kids immediately names Chase the conductor of the finger train. Oh, they are so excited. That's the future. Now, I'm completely convinced of it after seeing this stupid story about a new trend. Sunburn tattoos. Now, if you're not aware of what this is, it is exactly what I just said it is. A tattoo that you get by laying in the sun and letting your skin get a 1st or 2nd degree burn. So here's how they do it. So these yahoos put some sort of stencil or design on themselves, and they lay out in the sun until they burn. And then, hooray, they've got a really cool pattern, and they have a higher risk of skin cancer. But let's skip all of that stuff, and let's start rubbing asbestos all over ourselves so we can call it a day, huh? Right? Now, apparently doctors, I'm just telling you, doctors are apparently upset about this. Apparently doctors think this is just insane. Now, despite how much money a legion of morons purposely harming themselves might make them, they would still prefer if they would instead simply not try to get skin cancer. Probably that stupid Hippocratic oath, do no harm. So yeah, if you see a bunch of kids out there giving themselves a sunburn tattoo, you should go lock them in your basement until winter or something. Maybe you should just, walk up to your, have mom do this, have dad do it, have mom do it with the daughter, and have dad do it with the son, and just take them into the bedroom and say, take off your shirt. And if you see like the Batman outline or the infinity, whatever, if you see that, and they're scorched red with 1st degree or maybe even 2nd degree burns, counseling. First take them to the ER. Yeah, take them to the ER and get them checked out. And then take them to the psych ward and get that checked out. And then take them home and tell them that, you're taking all the electronics away and everything else. And if you ever catch them again getting a sunburn tattoo, just remember you heard it here first. See, I keep up with all the cool stuff. A sunburn tattoo. What do you think I should get? Send me an email. What kind of tattoo do you think I should get? And finally, you've heard me complain about those who believe in anthropogenic, man-made climate change, whether it's global cooling, global warming, whatever it is, that I think that is the height of arrogance. Well, guess who's going to prove me right? Do you know that migrants that are coming to this country are coming not because of something that God did, but because of something that we did? So the guy that is actually Irish, who pretends to be Hispanic, so his name is Robert Francis O'Rourke, but O'Rourke apparently is a derivation of some sort of Hispanic name that I wasn't aware of. And just because he can speak Spanish, somehow believes that he's Hispanic. I guess if you are you're a Christian, but you speak Yiddish, you must be a Jew. You speak Arabic, you must be a Muslim. You speak Japanese, you must be Japanese. It's utter insane. Anyway, Beto O'Rourke says that migrants have no choice but to come here because of U.S. climate change excesses. But it's what he says just before that I want you to pay attention to.
You've got to remember that they are fleeing the deadliest countries on the face of the planet today, compounded by drought that was caused not by God, not by...
Whoa, stop. Time out a minute. Drought not caused by God. Has anybody called God? I'm just curious. Somebody ought to call God and tell God that he's no longer in charge of droughts. He's no longer now. Yesterday evening, at least in my part of town, we had a really nice thunderstorm. Somebody should call God and tell God that despite his creation of nature and despite his creation of the laws of physics and all of that the thunderstorm that I had at my little abode last night was not because of God. Apparently, it was because of mankind. This is the height of arrogance. If you believe that people are fleeing droughts and that those droughts are not caused by God, but are caused by mankind, then you might just actually legitimately believe, that you know best what's better for people than they do for themselves. I think this is the height of arrogance. And I think this is at the very essence of those particular people like Robert Francis O'Rourke, who, if elected, would somehow take away your choice, your options, and say, you're going to do what I tell you to do because I know better.
You've got to remember that they are fleeing the deadliest countries on the face of the planet today, compounded by...
Wait, I'm sorry. I hate to keep interrupting. I sincerely apologize for continuing to interrupt Robert Francis O'Rourke. Let's go back to what he just said at the beginning. It just now struck me again.
You've got to remember that they are fleeing the deadliest countries on the face of the planet today.
Ooh, they are fleeing countries that are the deadliest places on the face of the earth today. I'm sorry. I find that kind of funny because I haven't seen any Uyghurs escaping the concentration. Oh, can I say concentration camps? I haven't seen the Uyghurs escaping the concentration camps in China. I haven't seen the Cubans fleeing Cuba. I haven't seen Venezuelans escaping Venezuela. I haven't seen the Ruskies. I haven't seen all of these people escaping all these communist countries. I haven't seen all of these people. Seriously? So they're escaping the most deadly places on the planet Earth, which I guess that's man-made, or is that God-made? I'm not sure which is which. All right, I'm going to let it run. I'm just going to let it run this time. Here is the Hispanic Irishman, Robert Francis Beto O'Rourke. Thank goodness he's speaking in English.
You've got to remember that they are fleeing the deadliest countries on the face of the planet today, compounded by drought that was caused not by God, not by Mother Nature, but by us. Man-made climate change, our emissions, our excesses, our inaction in the face of the facts and the science. When it is that deadly, and when you're unable to grow your own food to feed yourself, you have no choice but to come here.
Wow. It's all our fault. Just remember, it is all our fault. Well, actually, I refuse to take responsibility for it. So it's all your fault. So I'm going to blame you. It's your fault that all these people are leaving these S-hole countries. And I guess God is the reason they're S-hole countries, and then man is the reason that they have droughts. Isn't that exactly backwards? Isn't that truly exactly backwards from what the reality is? But who's going to question the Hispanic Irishman, Robert Francis Beto O'Rourke. Hey, thanks for listening to this episode of Michael Brown Unplugged. Be sure and follow us on iHeart, subscribe to us on iTunes, leave a 5-star review, leave a nice review if you can do that, and then follow us on YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. You can find all of those by simply going to my website, michaelbrowntoday.com, michaelbrowntoday.com. And then finally, I've got one last favor to ask of all of you. Every single one of you has somebody that would benefit, or maybe not, by listening to this podcast. Do me a favor this week. If I could get every single one of you to share the podcast with one other person, just one other person. It's like I'm raising money for a campaign, right? If I could just get each of you to share the podcast with one other person and get that one person to subscribe, bam, I could double the numbers overnight. And then I couldn't. Otherwise, I'm going to have to blame the Hispanic Irishman, Robert Francis O'Rourke. So again, thanks for listening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow.